The room went quiet the moment Commander SilenceHFY raised her hand. I stood at the edge of the negotiation hall, my rifle slung across my back, sweat gathering under my collar, even though the air recyclers kept the room cold. 40 human soldiers and 60 Veiltharn guards filled the space, all of us waiting for two sides to stop pretending they trusted each other. The ceasefire talks had lasted 3 days already. Nobody expected them to end well. I was not supposed to speak. I was not supposed to move. My orders were simple: stand behind Colonel Grant Hale, protect the human delegation, and let the diplomats do their work. I had done this 100 times before, on 100 different worlds. This time felt different from the first second I walked through the door. Commander SilenceHFY stood nearly 7 feet tall, her silver skin catching the light from the tall windows behind her. Her eyes were pale gold, sharp as blades, and they moved across our side of the table like she was counting how many of us she could remove from the room without lifting a finger. She wore ceremonial armor plated with symbols I did not understand, each one representing a battle her people had won. Beside her, a dozen Veiltharn officers stood in silence, watching us the way a predator watches something it has already decided is beneath its attention. Colonel Hale tried to steer the conversation back toward the supply routes we were arguing about. SilenceHFY cut him off before he finished his second sentence. "Your kind speaks of trade agreements," she said, her voice smooth and cold, as if you understand the weight of a promise. "You are young. You are loud. You wear metal because you have nothing else to protect you." Nobody in the human delegation answered right away. I felt the tension climb through the room like heat rising off pavement. Hale's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure, the way a good officer does. That should have been the end of it. Comments like that were common enough during these talks. We were used to being underestimated. Then SilenceHFY turned her head, and her eyes landed directly on me. I do not know why she chose me. Maybe because I was standing closest to the door. Maybe because I was young, barely 24, and she wanted an easy target. She studied my armor for a long moment, the plating scratched and dented from 3 tours of duty, and her lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "Look at this one," she said, loud enough for both delegations to hear. "A soldier dressed like a machine, because he fears what he is without it. Tell me, little human, what are you when the metal comes off? Nothing. An animal that fights because it knows nothing else." The room did not move. Nobody breathed. I could feel Hale's eyes cutting toward me, silently begging me not to react. I could feel my own heartbeat pounding against my ribs. Every instinct in my body wanted to answer her, to defend myself, to prove her wrong with words sharp enough to match hers. But something else took over instead, something quieter, something that came from a place inside me I did not fully understand yet. I reached up and unclipped the strap beneath my chin. Hale's eyes widened. Somewhere behind me, a soldier whispered my name, a warning, but I did not stop. I lifted my helmet off my head and set it down on the floor beside my boot. The room stayed silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. SilenceHFY's expression shifted, just slightly, confusion flickering behind her golden eyes. I did not look at her. I reached for the clasps on my chest plate next, undoing them one at a time, slow and steady, the metal clicking softly with each release. I set the chest plate down beside the helmet. Nobody in that hall said a word. 60 Veiltharn guards stood frozen, watching me the way you watch something you have never seen before and cannot explain. I undid the guards on my forearms next, then the plating over my shoulders, laying each piece down in a neat row like I was preparing for inspection instead of standing in the middle of a diplomatic crisis. Hale took one step toward me, his mouth opening like he wanted to stop this before it went further. I met his eyes for half a second and gave him a small shake of my head. He froze in place, unsure what I was doing, unsure what any of us were watching unfold. I unclipped the plating around my waist, then bent down and unbuckled the guards along my legs, one after another, until every piece of armor I had worn into that hall sat stacked neatly on the floor beside me. I stood there in my simple Under Armour fatigues, nothing covering me but cloth, in front of 60 armed strangers who could have ended things with a single order. I did not raise my voice. I did not clench my fists. I did not look at SilenceHFY again. I turned around and walked toward the door. My boots were the only sound in the entire hall, steady against the floor, each step carrying me farther from the argument, farther from the insult, farther from a fight that would have proven nothing except that her words had found their mark. I reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped out into the hallway without once looking back. Behind me, the silence held for another 10 seconds before I heard Hale finally speak, his voice tight and controlled, steering the room back toward business as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But something had happened. I could feel it in the way the air had changed, in the way my own hands were shaking slightly now that no one could see them. I did not know, standing in that hallway with my Under Armour damp against my skin, that I had just done something the Veiltharn had a name for. I did not know their history, their customs, their old and sacred meaning behind removing armor in front of an enemy. To me, it had been simple. She wanted a reaction. She wanted to see me break, to prove her point that humans were nothing more than animals wrapped in metal. I had decided, somewhere deep inside myself, that I would rather walk away with nothing on my back than let her words decide who I was. I found an empty supply room 3 corridors down and sat on a crate, my hands finally steady again, my mind replaying the last 5 minutes over and over. I had no idea what I had just started. I only knew that for the first time since arriving on this border world, I felt like myself again, stripped of every layer people used to judge me, standing only on what I actually was underneath. Outside the supply room, I could already hear boots moving fast down the corridor, voices low and urgent, spreading a story that had not even finished happening yet. I leaned my head back against the wall and closed my eyes, unaware that somewhere in that negotiation hall, Commander SilenceHFY was staring at the empty space where I used to stand, her golden eyes wide with something that looked almost like fear. By the next morning, my name was already moving through the outpost faster than any official report could travel. I woke up in my bunk to the sound of Private Owen Clark knocking on the frame of my door, his face pale, his eyes wide with something between excitement and confusion. He told me that half the base was talking about what happened in the negotiation hall, and not just the human half. The Veiltharn guards stationed near our barracks kept glancing my way whenever I walked past, their expressions unreadable, their silence heavier than before. I did not understand why removing my armor mattered so much until Lieutenant Mara Bell pulled me aside outside the mess hall later that day. She had spent 2 years working alongside Veiltharn officers before this deployment and knew more about their customs than anyone else on base. "You have no idea what you did, do you?" she said, her arms crossed, her expression somewhere between disbelief and concern. I told her honestly that I did not. I had simply reacted the way I always reacted when someone tried to provoke me, by refusing to give them the satisfaction of a response. Mara shook her head slowly. Among the Veiltharn, armor is not just protection, it is identity. It represents every battle they have survived, every rank they have earned, every piece of honor they carry. Removing it in front of an enemy is not a small thing. It means one of 2 things in their culture. Either you believe you are so far beyond needing protection that armor is meaningless to you, or you are declaring open conflict, telling them you do not need weapons to end them. I felt my stomach tighten. I didn't mean either of those things, I said. I just wanted to walk away without giving her the reaction she wanted. Mara studied me for a long moment. "That's the strange part," she said. "Whatever you meant, they don't know how to read it any other way, and SilenceHFY cannot let this go unanswered. Not now, not with half her own soldiers watching." I spent the rest of the day turning her words over in my mind, trying to understand a culture I had never studied, wrestling with the fact that something I saw as simple self-control had somehow been read across an entire species as either supreme confidence or a threat of war. That evening, Colonel Hale called me into his office. He did not look angry, which surprised me. He looked tired, the way officers look when they realize a situation has grown bigger than anyone expected. "You've put us in an interesting position, Voss," he said, leaning back in his chair. "The Veiltharn High Command has requested clarification on your actions. They want to know if your gesture was a formal insult or a formal challenge." "It wasn't either, sir," I said. "I just didn't want to give her the satisfaction of getting under my skin." Hale studied me for a long moment, then almost smiled. "Well, Corporal, you managed to do something 100 diplomats couldn't do in 3 days of talks. You made the entire Veiltharn delegation stop and actually think about us instead of talking over us." I did not know how to respond to that. I had not tried to make a statement. I had only tried to survive an insult without losing myself in the process. That night, lying in my bunk, I thought back to where I had learned that kind of quiet control in the first place. It was not something the military taught me. It came from somewhere much older, from a childhood spent on a colony world where pirates raided our settlements twice a year like clockwork, where the men who shouted the loudest were usually the same men who broke first when real danger arrived. My father used to tell me that the strongest people in any room were rarely the ones making noise. He taught me that anger given away for free was a gift to the person trying to provoke you, and I had spent years training myself never to hand that gift to anyone. I never expected that lesson to travel across the stars and land me in the middle of an alien diplomatic incident, but here I was, lying awake in a border outpost, wondering what Commander SilenceHFY was thinking on the other side of the base, and wondering just how much trouble my silence was about to cause both of us. The summons came 3 days after the incident in the negotiation hall, delivered not through Colonel Hale, but through a formal request sent directly to my quarters. A Veiltharn courier stood outside my door when I opened it, her posture rigid, her tone clipped and official, as she informed me that Commander SilenceHFY requested a private audience, unarmed, in the eastern garden of the outpost at sunset. I brought the message straight to Hale, half expecting him to refuse on my behalf. Instead, he read it twice, rubbed a hand across his tired face, and told me that refusing would likely cause more damage than accepting. The treaty negotiations were already fragile, and whatever had happened between me and SilenceHFY had somehow become tangled up in the larger question of whether humans could be trusted at the table at all. "You're going," he said finally, "but Voss, listen to me. Whatever she says, whatever she does, you keep that same control you showed in the hall. This entire situation started because you didn't react. Don't let it fall apart, because you do now." I nodded, though my chest felt tight with a nervousness I did not want to admit out loud. I had faced pirates as a boy, faced enemy fire as a soldier, but I had never faced anything quite like walking alone into a garden to speak privately with an alien commander who had publicly called me an animal 3 days earlier. The eastern garden sat behind the main administrative building, a strange patch of alien plants the Veiltharn had been cultivating since the outpost was built. Tall, silver-leafed trees that glowed faintly in low light, and flowers that closed themselves during the day and opened only after the sun went down. I arrived exactly on time, dressed in simple fatigues with no armor at all, a choice I made deliberately, though I was not entirely sure why it felt important. SilenceHFY was already there when I arrived, standing near the center of the garden, her ceremonial armor absent, replaced by a simple dark robe that made her look smaller, less like the towering commander who had humiliated me in front of both delegations, and more like someone uncertain of her own footing. She turned when she heard my boots on the gravel path, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. The silver trees rustled softly in the evening wind, their leaves catching the last orange light of the setting sun. "You came," she said finally, her voice quieter than I remembered it being in the negotiation hall. "You asked," I said simply, seemed rude not to. Something flickered across her face, not quite amusement, not quite offense. She gestured toward a stone bench nearby, and I sat across from her, close enough to speak plainly, but far enough to keep a respectful distance. "I have spent 3 days trying to understand what you did," she said. "My officers believe you challenged me. My elders believe you insulted our customs by mocking a sacred gesture without understanding its weight. I do not know which is true, and I find that I cannot move forward with these negotiations until I do." I studied her for a moment, searching for the right words. "It wasn't either of those things," I said. "Where I come from, when someone insults you, hoping you'll get angry, hoping you'll prove them right about who they think you are, the strongest thing you can do is refuse to give them that reaction. I wasn't declaring war. I wasn't showing off. I was just done letting your words decide who I was that day." Silanex's golden eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in genuine confusion, the way someone looks when they encounter an idea they have never considered before. "Among my people," she said slowly, "armor and honor are inseparable. What we wear is who we are. To remove it before an enemy means one of two things, and only two things. There is no third meaning in our history." "There is where I come from," I said. "My father used to tell me that the people who shout the loudest are usually the most afraid. He taught me that reacting to an insult gives it power over you. Walking away doesn't mean you have nothing left to fight with. Sometimes it means you've already decided the fight isn't worth having." She was quiet for a long moment, studying me the way a scholar studies an unfamiliar language, searching for patterns that might make sense of something entirely foreign. "You are saying your worth does not come from your armor," she said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them. "That removing it changes nothing about who you are underneath." "Exactly," I said. "That is not a concept my people have," she admitted, and there was something almost vulnerable in the way she said it. "Our strength is our identity. Without armor, without rank, without power, a Veiltharn is considered nothing. I called you an animal because I believed you needed metal to be anything at all. I did not expect you to prove me wrong by removing it entirely and walking away unafraid." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, letting the silence between us settle naturally instead of forcing words into a space where they were not needed. The garden grew darker around us as the sun dropped below the horizon, and the pale flowers around the path began to open one by one, releasing a soft, sweet scent into the cooling air. "You embarrassed me," Silanex said eventually, her voice quieter, almost private. "In front of my own soldiers, in front of yours. I called you nothing, and you responded by proving you needed nothing from me at all. My people do not easily forgive that kind of humiliation." "I wasn't trying to embarrass you," I said honestly. "I was trying to protect myself. I didn't think about how it would look to your people. I didn't know what it would mean." She studied me for a long time after that, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Perhaps that is the strangest part of all this," she said finally. "You caused the greatest disruption to my honor in decades, and you did it entirely by accident, understanding nothing of what you were doing." I almost laughed, though I caught myself before the sound escaped. "I suppose that's about right," I admitted. For the first time since I had met her, something in Silanex's expression softened, not quite a smile, but close enough to notice. "My elders will not let this rest quietly," she warned me. "They will want a resolution, something formal, something that satisfies the questions your actions have raised. I do not yet know what form that will take, but I suspect it will not be simple." "Nothing about this has been simple so far," I said. She rose from the bench then, her robe rustling softly in the evening air, and looked down at me with an expression I could not quite place, somewhere between curiosity and quiet respect. "You are not what I expected, human," she said. "I do not know yet whether that is a good thing or a dangerous one." "Neither do I admitted. She left the garden without another word, her footsteps fading into the darkness, leaving me alone among the glowing silver trees and the newly opened flowers, turning her words over in my mind, wondering exactly what kind of resolution her elders had in store for both of us. I stayed in the garden long after she left, watching the strange alien flowers glow faintly under the rising moons, thinking about everything my father had taught me as a boy, wondering if he ever imagined those lessons would someday matter to more than just one frightened kid on a raided colony world. I thought about the way Silanex had spoken about armor and identity, about how deeply different our two cultures understood the same simple act, and I began to realize, sitting quietly in that garden, that this misunderstanding was far from over. Word of my meeting with SilenceHFY spread through the outpost almost as quickly as the original incident had. By the next morning, Mara Bell found me in the mess hall, her expression tight with concern as she slid into the seat across from me. "The Veiltharn elders have called for a formal gathering," she said without preamble. "They want to address what happened between you and the commander directly, in front of representatives from both delegations." I set down my coffee, my appetite suddenly gone. "What kind of gathering?" Mara hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know exactly. But among the Veiltharn, when something disrupts the honor of a commander this significantly, it typically requires some kind of formal test or ritual to restore balance. I've read about ceremonies like this in historical records, but I've never seen one carried out in person." "A test," I repeated slowly, feeling a familiar tightness return to my chest. "What kind of test are we talking about, Mara?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but whatever it is, Colonel Hale is already being briefed on it right now. I'd get ready for another summons if I were you." I sat there for a long moment after she left, staring at my cold coffee, wondering what kind of ancient ritual an entire alien civilization might design around a simple decision I had made without a single moment of forethought. Somewhere across the base, gears were turning that I could not see. Decisions were being made that would shape not just my future, but potentially the future of an entire treaty between two very different species trying, however clumsily, to understand each other. Colonel Hale called me into his office 2 hours later, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know before he said a single word. He gestured for me to sit, closed the door behind us, and waited a moment before speaking, as if trying to decide how to explain something he himself did not fully understand. "The Veiltharn elders have proposed what they're calling a trial of standing," he said finally. "It's an old ceremony, rarely used, meant to resolve situations where a commander's honor has been publicly disrupted without a clear resolution. SilenceHFY cannot simply let your actions pass without response, not with her own soldiers watching, and this trial is apparently the only path that avoids actual conflict." "What does the trial involve?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my mind was already racing through every worst possibility. Hale slid a datapad across the desk toward me, showing a translated document covered in dense formal language. "From what our translators can determine, it's not a fight, it's not physical combat at all. It's a test of composure, patience, and restraint, conducted in front of witnesses from both delegations. The specifics are still being finalized, but the elders were very clear that it must not involve violence of any kind. Apparently there's precedent for these trials going badly in the distant past, and the Veiltharn have strict rules now to prevent that." I felt a small measure of relief at that, though it did nothing to calm the nervous energy building in my chest. "Why me? I'm not a diplomat. I'm not even an officer." "Because you're the one who started this," Hale said simply. "And because, whether you meant to or not, you've become a symbol to them of something they don't understand about humanity. The elders want to see if that symbol holds up under pressure, or if it was just an accident that happened to look impressive once." I sat with that for a long moment, turning the responsibility over in my mind like a stone I could not quite set down. I had never asked to represent anyone but myself. I had never wanted to carry the weight of an entire species' reputation on my shoulders because of one decision made in a single tense moment. But here I was, and there was no way to undo what had already been set in motion. "When does this happen?" I asked. 4 days, Hale said. "They wanted more time to prepare the ceremony properly. I've already spoken with Command about pulling you from this, finding another way to resolve the situation diplomatically, but the truth is, Voss, refusing now would likely do more damage than accepting. SilenceHFY has staked her own standing on this. If you refuse, it humiliates her further, and that could unravel everything the negotiators have built over these past weeks." I nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what he was telling me, even as every instinct in my body wanted to find some way out of a situation I had never intended to create. "I'll do it," I said finally, "but I want to understand exactly what I'm walking into before I agree to anything final." Hale nodded, clearly relieved, though his expression remained tight with concern. "Mara's been assigned to help brief you on Veiltharn customs over the next few days. Learn everything you can. Whatever this trial turns out to be, I have a feeling the details are going to matter more than any of us currently understand." Over the following days, I spent nearly every waking hour with Mara Bell, going through translated historical records, old accounts of previous trials of standing, and everything the human archives had gathered about Veiltharn honor culture since first contact. The picture that emerged was more complicated than I expected. The Veiltharn had once been a species defined almost entirely by pride and strength, their history filled with centuries of internal conflict, driven by leaders who could not tolerate any perceived weakness or insult without immediate, often violent response. It was only after a catastrophic war nearly 3 centuries ago, one that had cost them almost a quarter of their population, that their culture began shifting toward more disciplined, restrained expressions of honor. The trial of standing had emerged from that shift, a formal way to test whether someone's actions came from genuine strength of character or simply reckless bravado. "They almost destroyed themselves with pride," Mara explained one evening, sliding another datapad across the table toward me. "This trial exists because their ancestors learned, at enormous cost, that unchecked ego leads to ruin. Part of why your situation has caused such an uproar is that it touches directly on that old wound. They're not just testing you, Ezra. In some ways, they're testing themselves, testing whether they've actually learned the lesson their ancestors paid for so dearly." That thought stayed with me long after Mara left for the night, turning over in my mind as I lay awake in my bunk, staring at the ceiling of my quarters. I had walked into that negotiation hall as a soldier following orders, and somehow, without ever intending it, I had become tangled in questions about an entire civilization's identity and history. 3 days before the trial, I received an unexpected visit from SilenceHFY herself, arriving alone at my quarters just after evening meal, her expression unreadable in the dim corridor light. "I did not request this trial," she said without preamble, standing just inside my doorway. "My elders proposed it after word of our garden meeting reached them. They believe it will settle the question of your character, one way or another, in front of witnesses who can carry the outcome back to both our peoples." "Do you believe that?" I asked. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I do not know what I believe anymore," she admitted. "I called you an animal because I believed humans incapable of true honor, incapable of restraint, driven only by aggression and fear. You proved that assumption wrong in a single moment, without even intending to make a point. That unsettles me more than I expected it would." "For what it's worth," I said, "I don't think you're wrong to question us. Humans have plenty of history full of exactly the kind of recklessness you're describing. I'm not trying to prove humanity is perfect. I'm just trying to prove that not every human fits the picture you had in your head." Something in her expression shifted then, softening slightly, though her posture remained formal and composed. "The trial will test exactly that," she said. "Whatever the elders design, know that it is not meant to harm you. It is meant to reveal whether your restraint in that hall was genuine character or simple chance." "And if it turns out to be chance," I asked, "then the elders will conclude that humanity cannot yet be trusted with true partnership," she said plainly. "And this treaty, along with everything both our peoples have worked toward these past weeks, will likely collapse." The weight of that statement settled over me heavily, the understanding that far more than my own reputation now rested on however I handled whatever challenge awaited me in 4 days' time. SilenceHFY studied my reaction carefully, as if searching for any sign of fear or hesitation. "You are not what I expected, human," she said again, echoing words she had spoken to me once before in the garden. "I find myself hoping, against my better judgment, that you prove me right about that." She left before I could respond, her footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving me alone with the growing realization that in 3 days I would face a test I did not fully understand, carrying consequences far greater than I had ever imagined when I first unclipped the strap beneath my chin in that crowded negotiation hall. The days leading up to the trial passed in a blur of preparation, briefings, and quiet moments of doubt that I kept carefully hidden from everyone around me, including myself whenever possible. Mara continued walking me through every scrap of information the archives contained about these ancient ceremonies, though even she admitted the specifics remained frustratingly vague. "The trials are designed differently each time," she explained during one of our final sessions together. "They're built around the specific circumstances that caused the need for resolution in the first place. Whatever they design for you will likely reflect exactly what happened between you and SilenceHFY in that negotiation hall. So it'll test whether I can stay calm under pressure again," I said, more to myself than to her. "Probably," Mara agreed, "but knowing the Veiltharn, it likely won't be simple. They'll want to push you as far as they possibly can without crossing into actual harm, testing not just whether you can stay composed once, but whether you can maintain that composure even when everything around you is designed specifically to break it." I spent my final evening before the trial alone in my quarters, running through every possible scenario in my mind, trying to prepare myself for provocations I could not yet imagine. I thought about my father again, about the lessons he had drilled into me as a boy during those long nights when pirate raids left our colony shaken and afraid. I thought about the discipline it took to stay quiet when every instinct screamed at you to react, and I hoped, more than I had hoped for anything in a long time, that whatever I had shown in that negotiation hall 3 days ago had been real and not simply a moment of luck that would fail to repeat itself when it mattered most. The morning of the trial arrived cold and clear, the kind of sharp, bright daylight that made everything feel more real than usual. I dressed in simple fatigues again, no armor, following the same instinct that had guided me during my private meeting with SilenceHFY in the garden. Colonel Hale met me outside the main hall, his expression carefully neutral, though I could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, "you represent every soldier under this command. Remember what got you through that first moment, Voss. Don't let them shake it loose now." I nodded, unable to trust my voice enough to answer properly, and followed him through the doors, into a hall transformed since the last time I had stood there. Rows of witnesses lined both sides of the room, human soldiers and diplomats on one side, Veiltharn officers and elders on the other, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open skepticism. At the center of the room stood a wide circle marked into the floor with pale light, and within it, SilenceHFY already waited, dressed once again in her full ceremonial armor, her expression composed and unreadable. An elder stepped forward as I entered, an ancient Veiltharn with deep lines etched across silver skin, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. He explained, through a translator standing nearby, that the trial would consist of a series of provocations, delivered by members of the Veiltharn delegation, designed to test whether my composure in the negotiation hall reflected genuine character or simple chance. I would be required to remain within the circle, to respond to nothing with violence or anger, and to endure whatever came until the elders determined the trial complete. I stepped into the circle without hesitation, my heart pounding steadily beneath a calm exterior I fought hard to maintain. The first provocation came from a Veiltharn officer I did not recognize, his voice loud and mocking as he circled me slowly, listing every perceived weakness of humanity in vivid detail, questioning my courage, my intelligence, my worth as anything more than a disposable soldier following orders he did not understand. I said nothing, kept my eyes forward, and focused on my breathing the way my father had taught me years ago during nights when fear threatened to overwhelm good judgment. The officer eventually stepped back, clearly frustrated by my silence, making way for another who took a different approach entirely, questioning not my worth, but the worth of everyone I had ever fought alongside, naming soldiers who had died on distant worlds, suggesting their deaths had been meaningless, wasted on a species too proud to admit its own limitations. That one nearly broke me. I felt my jaw tighten, my hands curl slightly at my sides, memories of faces I had lost rising unbidden to the surface of my mind. But I held steady, reminding myself silently that reacting now would prove exactly what these elders feared most about humanity, that our composure was fragile, easily shattered the moment something struck close enough to matter. The provocations continued for what felt like hours, though I later learned it had been closer to 40 minutes, each one testing a different weakness, searching for the crack that would finally break my silence. Through it all, I kept my eyes forward, my breathing steady, drawing on every lesson my father had ever taught me about strength that did not need to announce itself loudly to be real. Finally, the ancient elder raised his hand, signaling an end to the provocations, and silence settled over the hall once more. He studied me for a long moment, his expression difficult to read, before turning to address the gathered witnesses in his own language, his words translated a beat behind for the benefit of the human delegation. "The trial is complete," the translation announced. "The human has demonstrated restraint under sustained provocation, consistent with the composure shown during the original incident. The elders find no evidence of chance or accident in his character. What was shown in the negotiation hall reflects genuine discipline, not mere circumstance." A murmur rippled through both sides of the hall, relief evident on the faces of the human delegation, something more complicated visible among the Veiltharn witnesses, respect mixed with lingering uncertainty about what this meant for their understanding of an entire species they had long dismissed as reckless and unrefined. I stood in the center of that circle, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort, and looked across the room at SilenceHFY, who remained silent throughout the entire trial, watching everything unfold with an expression I could not quite decipher, somewhere between vindication and something that looked almost like relief. News of the trial's outcome spread through the outpost within hours, carried by soldiers on both sides who had witnessed something none of us fully expected to see resolved so cleanly. Colonel Hale found me shortly after the hall emptied, his hand landing on my shoulder with a firmness that said more than words could have managed in that moment. "You did well, Voss," he said simply. "Better than well. You may have just saved this entire treaty." I did not feel like celebrating. I felt hollowed out, drained in a way that sleep alone would not easily fix, the accumulated weight of every provocation still settling somewhere deep in my chest. I thanked him quietly and asked for a few hours alone, a request he granted without hesitation, clearly understanding that whatever I had just endured needed time to process properly. I spent that afternoon walking the perimeter of the outpost alone, letting the cold air clear my head, replaying the trial over and over, searching for any moment where I had come close to breaking. The provocation about my fallen comrades had cut deeper than anything else, and even now, hours later, I could feel the echo of that anger simmering somewhere beneath the surface of my calm exterior. I understood, walking those quiet paths alone, that composure was not the absence of anger. It was simply the choice not to let anger decide your next action. That evening, as I sat alone in the mess hall, long after most soldiers had returned to their quarters, Mara Bell found me and slid into the seat across from me without asking permission, the way close friends often do. "Word is already spreading beyond this outpost," she said. "Command is calling it a turning point in the negotiations. The Veiltharn delegation has apparently softened considerably since this afternoon. Some of the older elders are even suggesting that human character might run deeper than they originally assumed." "That's good news, I suppose," I said, though exhaustion made it difficult to feel much of anything beyond relief that the trial itself was finally over. "It's more than good news," Mara said, leaning forward slightly. "It's exactly what these negotiations needed. You didn't just prove something about yourself today, Ezra. You proved something about all of us, something that might actually change how an entire species views humanity going forward." I sat with that thought for a long moment, uncertain how to carry a responsibility that large, especially one I had never asked to bear in the first place. I had joined this deployment as a soldier following orders, not as any kind of representative for humanity's collective character, and yet here I was, apparently having become exactly that through circumstances entirely outside my control. 3 days after the trial, negotiations resumed with a noticeably different atmosphere. I was not present for the formal talks themselves, my role limited strictly to security duties once again, but I could feel the shift in the way Veiltharn soldiers regarded me whenever our paths crossed around the outpost. The wary glances I had grown accustomed to since the original incident had softened into something closer to quiet acknowledgement, occasional nods exchanged between soldiers of two very different species finding common ground in unexpected places. SilenceHFY sought me out again roughly a week after the trial concluded, finding me during a quiet moment near the outpost's training yard, where I had been running through drills alone, trying to work the last of the tension from the trial out of my system through simple physical exertion. "The negotiations are progressing well," she said, watching me finish a set of exercises before I turned to acknowledge her properly. "Better than they have in weeks, in fact. My elders speak of you often, though not always in ways I fully understand yet." "What do you mean?" I asked, wiping sweat from my brow as I caught my breath. "They debate whether your character represents something unique to you specifically or something more common among your entire species," she explained. "I confess, I find myself curious about the answer as well." "I think it's probably somewhere in between," I said honestly. "Not every human would have handled that trial the way I did, but I don't think I'm unique either. I think there are plenty of people who understand what real strength looks like, even if it doesn't always show itself the way your culture expects." SilenceHFY considered this for a long moment, her golden eyes studying me with an intensity that had shifted considerably since our first encounter in the negotiation hall weeks earlier. "I owe you an acknowledgement," she said finally, her voice carrying a formality I had not heard from her since our garden meeting. "My words that day were unfair, spoken from assumptions I had never properly examined. You have shown me, through actions rather than argument, that those assumptions were incomplete at best." "I appreciate that," I said, and I meant it, though something in the way she spoke made it clear this was not simply an apology in the way humans typically offered them. "Among my people, we do not easily speak words of regret," she continued, as if reading the question forming in my mind. "Our history has taught us that spoken apology often means little without action to support it. I intend to offer something more meaningful than words when the proper moment arrives." I did not press her further on what that meant, sensing that whatever she had in mind was something she needed to decide for herself, in her own time, according to customs I still did not fully understand despite everything Mara had taught me over these past difficult weeks. The final phase of negotiations stretched across another 2 weeks, filled with the kind of tedious, detailed diplomatic work that rarely made for exciting stories but mattered enormously to the actual success of any lasting agreement between our two peoples. I returned to my regular duties during this time, standing guard during sessions, escorting delegates between meetings, gradually settling back into the routine rhythms of military life after the strange intensity of the trial that had briefly made me the center of attention across an entire outpost. Throughout those weeks, I noticed small shifts in how Veiltharn soldiers treated human personnel more broadly, not just myself specifically. Conversations that had once been strained and formal grew slightly more relaxed. Soldiers who had kept careful distance during the early days of this deployment began sharing meals occasionally, trading stories about their respective homeworlds, finding common ground in shared experiences of military life, despite the vast differences in culture and biology separating our two species. I found myself talking more frequently with a Veiltharn soldier named Kalis, a younger officer who had witnessed my trial firsthand and seemed genuinely curious about human customs in a way that felt refreshingly free of judgment. We spent several evenings comparing notes on training methods, discipline, and the strange universal experience of following orders you did not always agree with, finding humor in details that transcended the differences between our species entirely. "You confused everyone that day," Kalis told me one evening, sharing a meal in the mess hall despite the obvious differences in what our respective biologies required for nutrition. Even the elders who supported the trial did not fully expect you to succeed. Some believed you would break under the third or fourth provocation at the latest. I almost did, I admitted honestly. The one about soldiers I'd lost nearly got through. Kalis studied me for a moment, something like genuine respect crossing his expression. Yet you did not break, he said. That is precisely what unsettles my people most. We built our entire culture around visible strength, obvious displays of power and armor and rank. You showed us something quieter, and it troubles our elders more than open aggression ever could, because they do not fully know how to measure it against everything they have always believed about strength. That conversation stayed with me long after Kalis returned to his own quarters that evening, turning over in my mind as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my bunk, wondering exactly what kind of lasting impact these past weeks might have on relations between our two species going forward. I had never intended to become a symbol of anything larger than myself. I had simply refused to let one angry woman's words define who I was in a single tense moment. Yet here I was, apparently having shifted something fundamental in how an entire alien civilization understood humanity, all because I chose silence over anger on a day that had started like any other. The day the treaty was finally signed arrived with a formality that surprised me, considering how chaotic and uncertain those first weeks of negotiation had been. The entire outpost gathered in the same hall where everything had started weeks earlier. Human and Veiltharn personnel standing together along both sides of the room, watching as Colonel Hale and the senior Veiltharn negotiator finalized documents that would shape relations between our two peoples for years to come. I stood near the back of the hall, dressed in my full uniform this time, armor included, watching the ceremony unfold with a strange mixture of pride and disbelief that I had somehow played any meaningful role in bringing it about. Mara stood beside me, her expression thoughtful as the final signatures were exchanged, sealing an agreement that would open trade routes, share resources, and establish the kind of lasting cooperation between our species that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. When the formal signing concluded, applause spread through the human side of the hall, a gesture the Veiltharn observed with polite curiosity, clearly unfamiliar with such open displays of approval. Colonel Hale caught my eye across the room and offered a small nod, an acknowledgement I understood perfectly despite the lack of words. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring congratulations and relief spreading through both delegations, I noticed SilenceHFY making her way directly toward me, her expression carrying the same formal composure I had come to recognize over these past weeks, though something in her posture suggested this moment carried particular significance. The hall grew quieter as she approached, conversations trailing off as both human and Veiltharn witnesses noticed her deliberate path across the room. She stopped a respectful distance from me, her golden eyes meeting mine directly, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the weight of everything that had happened between us settling into that brief silence. "Corporal Voss," she said formally, her voice carrying easily across the now nearly silent hall. "What you demonstrated in this very room weeks ago, and what you endured during your trial, has changed something fundamental in how my people understand yours. I could offer you words of gratitude, but words, as I told you once before, mean little among my people, without action to support them." She reached up then, her hands moving to the ceremonial plating covering her left shoulder, the same ornate armor she had worn during our very first encounter, decorated with symbols representing decades of hard-won honor and status among her people. Slowly, deliberately, she unclipped the shoulder guard and lifted it away, holding it for a long moment before extending it toward me, resting it gently on the ground between us. A murmur rippled through the Veiltharn side of the hall, clearly recognizing the significance of what I did not yet fully understand myself. Mara leaned close, whispering quickly in my ear. "She's mirroring what you did that first day," she explained softly. "Among her people, this is the highest form of respect one warrior can offer another. She's telling everyone in this hall that she considers you an equal." I looked down at the armor resting on the floor, then back up at SilenceHFY, understanding settling over me slowly as the weight of the gesture became clear. This woman, who had once called me an animal in front of both our delegations, who had set in motion an entire trial designed to test my character under the harshest scrutiny her culture could devise, now stood before me, having removed a piece of her own identity, offering it as acknowledgement of everything that had unfolded between us. "Thank you," I said simply, unsure what else could possibly match the weight of what she had just done. "There is no need for thanks," SilenceHFY replied, straightening once more, her expression carrying something that looked almost like genuine warmth beneath its formal exterior. "You taught my people something we had forgotten across centuries of measuring strength only by what could be seen and worn. Sometimes the greatest strength is quiet. Sometimes it asks for nothing, proves nothing, and simply exists, unshaken by whatever tries to break it." The hall remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking, both delegations processing the significance of what had just occurred between us. Then, slowly, applause began again, spreading through the human side of the room first, before several Valtharn officers joined in with their own gesture of respect, a slow, deliberate tapping of their fists against their chest plates, a sound I had never heard before but somehow understood instinctively as approval. Colonel Hale approached shortly after, his expression carrying obvious relief mixed with something like quiet pride. "You've done more for this treaty than any diplomat in that room, Voss," he said quietly, once the crowd had begun dispersing properly. "I hope you understand what you've accomplished here, even if it started as nothing more than refusing to lose your temper." "I never meant to accomplish any of this," I admitted honestly. "I just didn't want to give her the satisfaction of a reaction she was hoping for." Hale smiled slightly, the kind of tired, genuine smile that came after weeks of stress finally lifting. "Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest decisions, Corporal. Never forget that." In the days that followed the signing ceremony, life on the outpost gradually settled into a new rhythm, one noticeably different from the tense uncertainty that had characterized those early weeks of negotiation. Human and Valtharn soldiers moved through shared spaces with an ease that would have seemed impossible before, trading stories, sharing meals when biology allowed, building the kind of casual friendships that formal diplomacy alone could never have produced on its own. I kept the shoulder guard SilenceHFY had given me, storing it carefully in my quarters, a reminder of everything those strange weeks had taught me about the unexpected consequences of a single quiet decision. I had not set out to change how an entire species viewed humanity. I had simply refused to let someone else's cruelty define who I understood myself to be, and somehow, through circumstances I could never have predicted, that simple refusal had rippled outward into something far larger than any of us had anticipated. Kalis found me one evening not long after, sharing a meal in the mess hall, as had become our habit over these past weeks, his expression thoughtful, as he studied the shoulder guard I had brought along, resting on the table between us. "You understand what she gave you, don't you?" he asked. "That piece represents nearly 40 years of earned status among our people. She could have offered words, gifts, anything simpler. She chose the most significant gesture available to her instead." "I understand it now," I said, running my fingers gently along the etched symbols decorating the metal surface. "I didn't at first. I thought she was just returning a favor, mirroring what I'd done that day in the negotiation hall." "In a sense, she was," Kalis agreed. "But among my people, that mirroring carries weight you may not fully appreciate. She was telling everyone present that she no longer considers your armor, or the lack of it, any measure of your worth. She was declaring, in the clearest way our culture allows, that she sees you as an equal, not despite being human, but simply because of who you have shown yourself to be." I sat with that thought for a long moment, turning it over carefully, understanding finally the full weight of what had transpired in that hall weeks ago, and everything that had unfolded since. I had walked into that negotiation, expecting nothing more than another routine security assignment, another day protecting diplomats through conversations I barely understood. I had left it having somehow reshaped relations between two entire species, all because I chose silence over anger when provoked. The outpost eventually returned to something resembling normal operations, though the atmosphere never quite settled back into the tense wariness that had defined those early days before the treaty. Trade routes opened as promised, resources began flowing between our peoples, and slowly, gradually, the foundations were laid for a partnership that would likely outlast every soldier and diplomat who had witnessed its difficult beginning. I received new orders eventually, reassignment to a different post entirely, the natural rhythm of military life carrying me away from the place where everything had unfolded. On my final evening at that outpost, I returned once more to the eastern garden where SilenceHFY and I had first spoken privately, watching the pale flowers open slowly as the sun dropped below the horizon, the silver trees glowing softly in the gathering darkness around me. I thought about my father then, about lessons learned on a colony world scarred by fear and violence, lessons that had somehow traveled across the stars to reshape something far larger than either of us could have imagined when he first taught a frightened boy that anger given freely was a gift to those who least deserved it. I thought about every soldier who had witnessed that first tense moment in the negotiation hall, about SilenceHFY standing across from me during my trial, about the weight of a shoulder guard now carefully packed among my belongings, ready to travel with me to whatever came next. I understood now something I had only sensed instinctively that first day. Standing quietly as an alien commander tried to provoke a reaction she believed would prove everything she assumed about my kind. Strength did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply existed, steady and unshaken, refusing to be defined by anyone else's expectations or insults. Sometimes the most powerful statement a person could make was choosing silence over noise, patience over anger, and walking quietly away from a fight that would have proven nothing except that someone else's cruelty had found its mark. She had wanted a reaction that day, something to justify every assumption she carried about humanity's supposed recklessness and fragility. Instead, she had found a man who simply stopped listening to her provocation, who set down his armor and walked away without a single word, carrying nothing with him except the quiet certainty of who he already knew himself to be. And in that silence, somewhere between an insult meant to wound and a gesture meant to heal, she had finally heard something true,